We are here today to commemorate a video that represents Florida's 15th Congressional District in the National Local Legacies Project of the Library of Congress Bicentennial Celebration. Before I go any further, I want to thank the Economic Development Commission for taking the lead on this project and A Cut Above Video Productions for producing the video. They are the sponsors of this video, and they deserve a warm round of applause. This December, I will have the pleasure of presenting this video to the Library of Congress in order for it to be permanently housed for future generations. The Local Legacies Project is designed to document and pay tribute to our nation's rich cultural heritage. The Library of Congress hopes to ensure future generations have access to this important snapshot of American culture and traditions. Our part of that rich cultural heritage has been, in part, our historic role in the U.S. space program. This region is aptly named the Space Coast because East Central Florida has had a role in virtually all of our nation's space projects, whether military, commercial, or civil. This video attempts to document from a personal perspective the impact the space program has had on Brevard County, the state of Florida, and the nation. Since that historic day in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy announced we were sending men to the moon, the Space Coast has been the gateway to space. Today, the space race is no longer a race to the moon, but rather an economic race, and the Space Coast is committed to maintaining its global leadership in exploring and developing space. With fierce international competition, we have to work to remain the premier gateway to the stars. And I am confident that the community commitment shown during the first 50 years of our space program will continue and will propel the Space Coast into the 21st century. I am honored to present to you the Library of Congress Local Legacies Project, Thrust into Space.
At the turn of the 20th century, this untamed stretch of Florida's eastern coastline was virtually untouched by the hand of man. Fishing shanties, cattle ranges, and citrus groves sparsely populated this scrubland infested with mosquitoes. Life was simple, slow, quiet. But perhaps every so often on a moonlit night, they looked up into the sky and wondered, what's really out there? As the 21st century dawns, rockets streak across the skies of Brevard County, and a new era of spaceflight continues. Who could have possibly imagined that its fate was written in the stars as early as 1865 by a French visionary across the Atlantic Ocean? Science fiction author Jules Verne, in his novel From Earth to the Moon, wrote of an imaginary moon rocket.
Jules Verne sighted his launch to the moon here in Florida. It's very ironic, a holy coincidence maybe, that we have Florida as a launch site for the moon program, you know.
Coincidence? Maybe. Or perhaps Jules Verne foresaw Florida's potential as a future moonport. The U.S. military made the same discovery almost a century later, when it picked a sandy stretch of land sandwiched between the Atlantic Ocean and the Banana River to launch its missiles. It was a decision which would make Brevard the only county in the U.S. with a history of manned spaceflight. But what about the people who made the dream of spaceflight come true? Who were these early space pioneers? How did they get here?
I grew up in the days of Buck Rogers and the science fiction books, because there really weren't any space programs. When I was in high school, I guess the Bay of Pigs was being conducted, and that kind of brought my attention to the Space Center here, which wasn't a space center. It was almost unknown at that point.
All right, lift off and the clock has started.
I always had a dream of aviation or rocketry,
And I always followed it low-key until I saw that redstone go up with Mr. Shepard in it. And that's it. That's where I'm going. I need to be there. I need to be part of that action.
I was just fresh out of Georgia Tech, and I saw an ad for rocket engineers at Huntsville. And the one interesting thing about this whole space business, in 1951 and in the early 50s, you didn't go out and hire a rocket engineer with 10 years, 5 years, 20 years experience. We were all young.
So I got a letter from Convair saying, "We just won the Atlas contract. I don't know what you're going to be doing, but it will be exciting."
In the space race, I remember the Sputnik going up. I was in the Navy at the time the Sputnik went up, and I remember thinking that we're really behind as Americans in this space race.
At the very day that we crossed the line from Georgia into Florida, I heard on the radio that Werner von Braun and General Medeiros, his boss, had just gotten up our first satellite. And I said, this is a harbinger of things to come for me and my school that I had been thinking about.
Even if it was just a little beeping satellite, meant something big. I didn't quite understand what it meant, but I wanted to be part of it.
They are trailblazers to the stars, the heart and soul of America's space program. This is their story. Some are products of World War II. Others were influenced by childhood tales of space adventure, model rockets, toy spaceships, and outer space comic books. They are eyewitnesses to spectacular moments in 20th century history.
It has had a remarkably unique impact on this area. All you have to do is look at a map. We have towns with names like Satellite Beach. You drive around this community and you see NASA Boulevard and Gemini Elementary School, and it's a tremendous source of pride.
Perhaps that's why Brevard County is known worldwide as the Space Coast.
Claude, we are getting a spectacular view of all of Florida at this moment.
In the 1940s, military might bolstered Brevard County's economy. World War II brought an economic boom to the county with the creation of the Melbourne Naval Air Station, now the site of Melbourne's International Airport, and the Banana River Naval Air Station, now known as Patrick Air Force Base. The federal government invested heavily in the county's infrastructure, building roads and bridges and runways. Meanwhile, further north at the Cape Canaveral Lighthouse, the Coast Guard kept a watch out for German U-boats. But soon, this lone beacon's light in the sky would be joined by rockets' red glare. The space age was dawning, and folks from across the country were hearing about a place called Cape Canaveral.
The Air Force was designated to hold what was known as Banana River Naval Air Station until a base was selected for the launch of a missiles program. They sent 40 of us in from here, 40 enlisted, and 3 officers to maintain the base.
We came with about 35 of us from White Sands, and others joined us. And we're talking here about late 1949 and early 1950. And then, of course, GE, and along with several people from the Army Rocket and Guided Missile Agency from Huntsville, which later became Marshall Space Flight Center, came down to assist in the delicate assembly of the V-2 because it got trucked here in parts.
In 1949, the Army expanded its launch operations to include the new missile test range at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Key research and development leaders at the Cape were German scientists Werner von Braun and Dr. Kurt Diebes. Even in those early days of military rocket research, many dreamed of space exploration.
We all gathered at the base theater, and a colonel got up and told us at that time that this was going to be the missile range. And they designated this as the missile range because of the off-base islands, chain of islands, from the Grand Bahama to Antigua, which is 1,500 miles. and this is ideal for a tracking basis.
The missile range encompassed the Banana River Naval Air Station, now known as Patrick Air Force Base, the Bahama Island chain, and 15,000 acres of wild scrub and marshland known as Cape Canaveral. It would soon live up to its new name with a rocket named Bumper. When military and civilian workers arrived to carve out roads and construct the first 4 launch pads on Cape Canaveral, they did not receive a warm welcome from local residents. By 1950, the U.S. government had purchased, or in some cases condemned, their property while acquiring land necessary to support the first launches from the Cape.
At that time, there was probably 200 people up there that thought they were going to stay there the rest of their lives and things like that, till the government started moving in.
When the Corps of Engineers come in as the government's agent and literally took this property away from the earlier settlers out here, they were very bitter for many years.
Because they were generally Florida crackers. They loved that place, and they didn't mind the Coast Guard station there, but they didn't want people coming on shooting, as they call it, skyrockets off their Cape.
The area's first settlers were commonly called Florida crackers. They lived in wood frame houses with aluminum shingled roofs and porches, much like this home built in 1916. Today, the Grant Historical House is a landmark and one of the few remaining vestiges of the early settlers along Florida's eastern coast and waterways.
They had a settlement up on the north end, up above the lighthouse, where they had the post office for Cape Canaveral. And then down to the south, they had a little settlement just north and east of the present South Gate, where they called that little settlement Artesia.
Merritt Island stretched from the Banana to the Indian River, and at the time was home to the community of Georgiana, a village of 25 families of mostly pineapple and citrus growers. This early 1900 schoolhouse is only one of 8 of Georgiana's original buildings in existence. Later settlers on northern Merritt Island would relinquish their land to the U.S. government in the name of space.
Even as the last few settlers put up a stubborn fight to remain, truck convoys carrying Bumper rocket parts filed onto the Cape from White Sands, New Mexico.
Bumper's staging area was here at Launch Pad 3. Only a faded outline remains where the launch table once stood, only 4 feet off the ground. To my left stood the Launch Control Shack, where engineers sought refuge and monitored Bumper's progress through periscope mirrors. But launch day, July 19th, 1950, did not go as planned.
Bumper 7 was supposed to be the first launch. We took it up on the pad, fueled it, got everything going, and got the WAC Corporal on top, fueled, everything was going nice. The countdown went on down, and we had a misfire.
5 days later, on July 24th, Bumper 8 was cleared for liftoff. A handful of reporters stood only 400 feet away as the rocket reached 10 miles in altitude.
There weren't many reporters covering this launch because I don't think anyone was concerned or there was not that much interest at the time.
Cocoa Beach residents in the little town of Cape Canaveral thought mainly that this was some kind of a stunt, and nobody really took it too seriously until after the Bumper 8 went off. And then when Bumper 7 went a few days later, there was a lot of crowds of people on the beach watching it.
Well, at the day of that launch, I don't think we realized what the future meant for us. It was the beginning of the space program.
Soon after Bumper, the military began experimenting with winged missiles. First the Lark, then the Matador, then the Snark. Because many failed Snark launches produced spectacular missile dives into the Atlantic Ocean, locals dubbed it snark-infested waters. On land, engineers and technicians struggled with primitive technology, inclement weather, and inhospitable wilderness.
Our equipment then, compared to today, as far as checkout, was very primitive. We didn't have all the automation. We had some, but very primitive. But we depended on engineers looking at dials and strip chart recorders and gauges.
For the Lark, when they was launching that, they brought a World War II tank from Patrick out here to serve as a blockhouse.
The fledgling rocket program was also hard-pressed to recruit new workers. The Cape might have been prime real estate for rockets, but it was not prime residential property.
When we first opened the base, that's the Army Proving Ground, we were authorized so many civilian personnel. We could not get people to come to work here because there was no living, no housing.
No, there was no housing. We were supposed to move into base, and we went to the base. Norris opened the door fell off the house. It was right on the beach, everything was rusted. So the next morning I was back with Mother in Tampa.
We first drove down here and come into Brevard County. I wasn't sure where we had come to because I thought of this being a tropical place, and all I saw was it didn't look very tropical. It was not very inviting, matter of fact, when I first came here.
Rattlesnakes, mosquitoes, humidity, and generally a horrible place to work or live.
Brevard County was in dire need of bedroom communities for the space workers. A building boom began in earnest when the government and missile contractors helped finance the construction of concrete block homes in subdivisions such as this one. Similar developments were built throughout the county.
It was $100 down, and the houses were at 4%, and they ran from around $9,000 to maybe $12,000, $14,000.
I came to Titusville. There were 2 houses available in Titusville to rent.
Traffic congestion added to the newcomers' frustrations. A1A was the only road leading to and from the Cape, but it was only 2 lanes, bottlenecking traffic. Some folks would spend as many as 2 hours commuting just 30 miles to the Cape. The highway was later expanded to 4 lanes, and as the space program grew, a network of causeways, highways, roads, and bridges sprang up.
But Brevard County had a remarkable change in a 10-year period from 1955 to 1965, when the county population went from 16,000 to approximately 250,000. We had no planning at that time because there was no way of doing it, didn't have time to do it.
So it was rough, the water was bad, until the cocoa water system came into existence 2 or 3 years later. No stores. If we wanted to go to a big store, a department store or something, we had to drive over to Orlando, which was about 50 miles.
In 1958, though living conditions were improving, working conditions out at the Cape would take an emotional toll on the families of many space workers. On October 4th, 1957, the Russians shocked the United States with the launch of the world's first satellite known as Sputnik. Until then, Americans hadn't paid much attention to their own neophyte missile program. Now the pressure was on at the Cape. The space race had begun, and the U.S. was losing.
My dad was part of Dr. von Braun's Redstone team, and they thought they'd been held back. They were ready and they were delayed, and then the Russians got up there first. So I remember people being mad.
We could have launched a satellite a year before Russia launched Sputnik 1. But General Eisenhower and powers that be decided that they would let the Navy, under the Vanguard program, launch the first satellite in cooperation with the International Geophysical Year at that time, and Russia launched a little ahead of time.
As the Russians were launching the world's first satellite, the Cape continued to rain rocket parts, with 8 major failures in just 2 months during 1957. With the world spotlight on Russia's advanced rocket technology, the U.S. military scrambled to catch up, testing intermediate-range ballistic missiles at the Cape.
And yes, we blew up a lot of them in those days. And I first come down here, I believe that the first I came down to work on the Atlas program, the first 4 that we launched failed.
The only one that was really of a concern to many of us was the Titan rocket, because it had a nitrous oxide in it which was poisonous that would drift in the atmosphere.
The Navy developed a non-weapons missile, the Vanguard, which was supposed to launch America's first satellite known as Vanguard 1, but it never got off the ground. The Army came to the rescue with its Redstone rocket developed by Wernher von Braun and his team of rocket scientists. The Redstone would later launch man into space, but first it had to succeed with a 40-pound satellite.
On January 31st, 1958, here in Blockhouse 26, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency's commander, Major General John Medeiros, was on hand to witness an historic event. A modified Army Redstone rocket finally boosted the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, into space. The U.S. was now just 2 satellites behind Russia, and America's faith in space was renewed.
We knew something big was happening because our dads were working long hours, 7 days a week. And so one night, a whole bunch of us went over to the beach, and that was the night Explorer 1 was launched. I knew it's going to change the world.
Few at the time realized Explorer 1 would not only change the world, but link this one to the next. The space race was now becoming a race to the moon.
In the early day, we didn't think in terms of, we weren't thinking about the manned space. Von Braun had been working on this, of course, but we weren't thinking about putting a man on the moon or anything like that. We were more concerned about serving, we were serving the Air Force, trying to help the Air Force with this missile program.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced the Apollo manned space program, a $24 billion initiative employing 20,000 contractors with 400,000 skilled workers, most sent to work at the Cape.
And we went from, a very, very small county before I got here, think of Bumper 1 with just a rural orange-growing county, to a rocket society which needed engineers, highly educated people.
The Apollo program further changed Brevard County's demographics as young technicians and engineers flooded the county, most in their mid-20s. They brought with them a youthful, can-do spirit.
When we came here, nobody was available to do the work except the young engineers that were just getting out of college and didn't know that you couldn't do anything. So we went ahead and did it.
Most of the people were young people. We were all in our 20s to 30s because of the engineers and all the people who were coming in on the space program.
When you have a group that are young, you're not afraid of failure.
The U.S. government had already created a civilian space agency known as NASA 3 years earlier. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration's mandate was to enter space for scientific and peaceful purposes. The U.S. government bought up northern Merritt Island and created what's now called the John F. Kennedy Space Center. The island itself spans 88,000 acres and is wedged between the Indian and Banana Rivers.
If you consider what we did when Kennedy in May of 1961 said we're going to the moon, we're going to bring in this decade and return, not because it's easy, because it was hard. If you think that's incredible, because Merritt Island was Gatorland, and mosquitoes.
NASA selected 7 candidates, one of whom would become America's first astronaut in space, and sent them to the Cape for most of their training. The program was called Mercury, and would prove that humans could fly safely in space. Astro-chimps became America's first living beings in space, paving the way for astronaut Alan Shepard's historic launch. Shepard placed his fate in the hardware of a Mercury Redstone rocket, becoming the first American in space.
I went home, got my 8mm movie camera, went out on the jetty just to take a picture of this thing because I couldn't believe that we were going to put a man on one of these things.
On May 5th, 1961, engineers and technicians here at Blockhouse 5-6 held their collective breath as they sent Alan Shepard soaring 117 miles into the sky on a 15-minute suborbital flight. Although the Russians had again beaten the U.S. with the launch of cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin just a month earlier, Shepard proved America could pioneer the final frontier and pave the way for man to set foot on the moon.
Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear. This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go 1.2 G.
As the first Americans entered space in the early 1960s, military and civilian workers feverishly developed rocket technology at the Cape. Launch pads sprang up along its coastline from tip to tail. This was the dawn of the intercontinental ballistic missile. Civilians now shared the military facilities as they worked to integrate the Atlas rocket into the Mercury program and the Titan rocket into Gemini's two-man astronaut program. However, a moon launch required a much larger rocket.
The Mercury program and the Gemini programs were very essential parts to be able to train and be able to get ready to go to the moon. We couldn't have done it without doing those programs.
Those early Atlas Mercuries, we call those, all those parts that we put together to make an engine, those were man-certified parts. And we gave extra attention and detail because just the thought of putting people on these vehicles that just not too long ago were still blowing up when we pushed the button.
The development of Apollo's mammoth Saturn V rocket would become man's ticket to the moon. But the 26-story tall rocket needed a larger launch complex. So manned space launches moved from the Cape to Kennedy Space Center here on Merritt Island. Pad 39A was built along with a huge assembly building to construct the rocket. On July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11 blasted off to the moon. Today, it's the Space Shuttle Complex.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
On July 20th, 1969, a mere 8 years after President Kennedy issued his National Moon Challenge, the crew of Apollo 11, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, did indeed land on the moon as astronaut Michael Collins circled above them.
40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, just. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And it was a feeling of real elation as the thing lifted off. I don't know where the vehicle roared louder or the people around roared louder.
It's very gratifying now when I look back on it. I thought, I got to live my dream. I got to be part of a launch team that made the biggest thing happen that happened in this century.
In your mind, Lord, you know, just let this thing go. So we had confidence in the equipment, but still it was an awesome thing to see that first stage, second stage, third stage, and instrument unit, and then the spacecraft do all the things just like you planned it on the program.
Well, it was exciting in the fact that you felt like you were being part of history, and you had the program in mind. You didn't really think about yourself that much.
As man shattered the barriers between this world and the next, barriers were also breaking for women in the space program.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I was one of the first women that went down on the complexes. And I covered 11, 12, 13, 14, 36A and B, which basically was the Atlas complexes.
I was in the Launch Control Center for Apollo 11. I was the only woman there. I had already been a little bit of a controversy in working out there for tests. Some of the men didn't want me to be there.
History would later record Sally Ride as the first female U.S. astronaut. on the Challenger Space Shuttle mission of June 18, 1983. In 1999, another milestone for women was reached when Eileen Collins became the first female shuttle commander.
Reaching new heights for women in X-ray astronomy.
Houston, Columbia is in the roll. We've got a fuel cell PH number 1.
The 1950s ended with Russia successfully probing the moon and orbiting live creatures. The 60s began with President Kennedy's announcement of the Apollo lunar program and the Russians' launch of the first man in space. The Cold War was intensifying, and a wave of fear swept over American families. Pressure mounted on workers at the Cape, and their families began to suffer the strain.
I say I raised 2 children by myself. He was gone an awful lot. Anything happened at the base, he, being in the fire department, he had to go.
There's a lot of families that broke up during this time because the women were left to do everything.
I spent so much time out there, my job was priority, and I put my family second. Because you can convince yourself what I'm doing is for them.
We were all working hard, a lot of overtime. Most of us didn't know we were making history. And we were military secret work. We couldn't talk to even our wives much about what we were doing.
But back then, we didn't know anything. When they went to work, we didn't know if he was going to come home that night.
Space was also making Brevard County an international star. The whole world was watching. Families gathered in living rooms across America to watch live TV broadcasts from the Cape. Presidents visited, reporters congregated, and the first astronauts, known as the Mercury 7, came to town to train. In 1965, NBC began airing a space-inspired sitcom called I Dream of Jeannie, set in Cocoa Beach.
Several presidents visited, and of course in the early days when the astronauts came in, that was a pretty big thing, the original 7, and really the whole, the Space Coast was sort of in a, like in euphoria, everybody was upbeat.
When we would launch a missile in my neighborhood in Melbourne, everybody would listen to the radio because they didn't carry much on TV in those days. And people would scream up and down the street, "Missile, missile, missile," and everybody would run outside and look at it. They were very excited about it.
It was secret in that you didn't know much ahead of time, but of course when you lived here, as I mentioned, you see the symptoms. Certain people are working a lot, they're working late.
The space program was our life, very much our life. And it wasn't just the job, it was the program itself that was important.
In fact, I've said many times, I would pay to work out there during that period because, I loved it.
Bernard Surf became a popular local watering hole where space workers would nurse their mosquito bites and swap stories. The restaurant opened its doors in 1948, filling a social void as a community catch-all.
Back in the early 50s, when they were building things, starting to build Patrick and that sort of thing, we would cash, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 worth of checks on a Friday night. We were the bank.
Over the next 50 years, Bernard Surf grew alongside the Space Center and quickly became a favorite place for the who's who of the space program.
We were full. We had people everywhere, standing everywhere. Big parties and, big companies and celebrities and newscasters. And at the door, Wernher von Braun walks in by himself and said, "Could I have a table for 1, please?" And we were just shocked that, there's Wernher von Braun.
Bernard Surf also marked a prime spot along the community's Welcome Home parades.
During the Apollo days, I think it was, when they would fly the astronauts back, they would land them at Patrick, and then they would take them to the Cape. But somebody came up with the idea of painting a red carpet at the beginning of the city of Cocoa Beach, and they would have a parade.
But by the early 1970s, America's enthusiasm for space was waning, and so was governmental funding. 3 Apollo missions were nixed, and the crew of Apollo 17 became the last humans to set foot on the moon in the 20th century. the economic boon that space built in Brevard County was going bust.
It was tough because we went from, you know, like 30,000 workers down to like 10,000 workers right after Apollo. There were lots of people laid off, lots of people left the county, including myself.
It was quite an impact on the people down here.
Some of the people says, I don't want to go. I want to stay in Brevard County even if I have to pick oranges. I'm not going.
We were, in years past, very, very dependent on the space program. The problem, of course, with that is that as the funding for the space program goes up and down, so does our local economy.
Today, institutions like Florida Institute of Technology are economic mainstays of the local economy. Though born out of the space program, over the years, Florida Tech has helped transform Brevard County into an intellectual and technological epicenter. Located 29 miles south of Cape Canaveral, in the early days, this institution helped educate the space industry's young workers.
Brevard County was a virtual higher educational wasteland. There was absolutely nothing here in the way of higher education opportunities. And so that's why I set out to try to see if I could do something about that. Being a night school, and every time we had a night launch, we had to call off all the classes because all the faculty and all the students had to report for work out at the Cape to get the launch up. And Newsweek picked this one up and ran an article on FIT and called it Countdown College.
By the early 60s, Florida Tech was able to purchase land in Melbourne and construct a permanent campus with financial support from a company called Radiation Incorporated, later absorbed by Harris Corporation. In just 3 decades, this so-called Countdown College evolved into a fully accredited private university with an international student body of more than 4,000 students.
We have a growing high-tech industry here on the Space Coast, specifically an electronics industry that is really booming, and those industries have the potential to help us as the space side goes up and down.
In the early 1950s, the military began dredging a harbor near the southern tip of Cape Canaveral to allow cargo shipments. The harbor was expanded in the late 1950s to create a deep water servicing basin for Navy submarines, outfitted with ballistic missiles. The area is now known as Port Canaveral, a major center for cruise ships and commercial cargo.
This has probably economically been one of the biggest advantages to the local community outside of the Air Force Station itself.
Long before rockets, the loggerhead turtle, sea turtle, and the manatee were the first to call the Cape home. Many areas of the Space Center's property are protected wildlife refuges, including the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and the Canaveral National Seashore. This preservation helped make peace with the Cape's early settlers.
It's just the last few years that this bitterness has made a complete turnaround, and now they feel that it was probably one of the best things that happened to this area because it's preserved much of the area in its natural state.
The Cape's mystic and native beauty at times seems at odds with its ultra-modern space hardware and high-tech inhabitants. Film crews frequent the area, having discovered an ideal movie set for a variety of productions.
Both the Cape and the whole space launch complex out here, including NASA, has attracted a large influx of movie makers, producers, directors.
Space-related tourism also continues to be Brevard's bread and butter. The Visitor Center, Spaceport USA, is a major tourist attraction dating back to the early 60s when the Kennedy Space Center first opened its gates. But the economic savior of the local economy was a reusable space vehicle known as the Space Shuttle. By the late 70s, the space race was won, and the U.S. government was not interested in funding NASA's ambitious plans for permanently manned space stations and flights to Mars. Instead, the government bankrolled a reusable spacecraft, which was launched like a rocket and landed like a plane.
We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start.
On April 12, 1981, Space Shuttle Columbia blasted off from Kennedy Space Center, writing a new chapter in space history.
When that thing lifted off and worked the way it was supposed to work, I mean, most of us, old, seasoned veterans, engineers, you know, that don't get all that emotional about things, we use facts, and we were, most of us, in tears when that thing launched.
But after that first successful launch, the space shuttle was here to stay. Today, shuttle launches and unmanned rocket launches of satellites and commercial payloads remain the bulk of space activity out at the Cape.
This 42-foot-high granite mirror stands as a monument to American astronauts who have perished in the pursuit of the heavens. It serves as a bittersweet reminder of the triumphs and tragedies of America's manned space program. The names of the deceased are forever etched in the minds and hearts of Brevard County residents who witnessed and experienced that joy and pain in a very personal way.
January 28, 1986. A cold day at the Cape, which forever sends shivers up the spines of millions who watched it on live TV. The Challenger space shuttle rose from the pad and 73 seconds later burst into flames, leaving spectators in wide-mouthed shock. The Challenger mission was part of a movement to introduce space to and educate the public at large by launching teachers, artists, journalists, and other non-space professionals who could share their experiences.
I guess when we went through Challenger was very emotional, of course, because when you know all the crew members and you were with their spouses and family when that happens.
It was horrible. You see the pieces, I knew how it was built. I saw it fall apart just like it was built. I saw the pieces streaming down. But more than that, I heard the cries of anguish from the families. And it was bad.
I think the Challenger disaster was a loss of innocence. There was a sense that somehow the daring do and the hard work that had always shown, that somehow that was lost. I think that the post-Challenger generation of engineers, technologists, have a sober and perhaps more realistic notion. This is high advanced technology. That means taking risks. And risks sometimes lead to memorials like this.
But it was the tragic Apollo 1 fire here at Pad 34, 19 years earlier, that marked the beginning of the end of America's honeymoon with space. As a local radio broadcaster, I was one of the first to break the tragic story. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died here as they simulated launch conditions in a countdown demonstration test. A spark ignited like wildfire in their pure oxygen capsule, and there was no escape. It was January 27th, 1967. One pool reporter was allowed by NASA to view the burned-out capsule, George Alexander of Aviation Week. Here is his account of what he saw.
What burned? I'd have to say just about everything that was in there, except for these few odd bits and pieces, like a page which had only its edges, a page about this size, which had only its edges slightly browned, and this bit of parachute harness, but everything else burned.
We had a bunch of news people in here that night, and I can't remember who alerted me to it, but somebody did. And so I went back to the tables that I knew were news people, and I said there's been an accident on the pad. And of course they all got up and ran out.
The Apollo 1 was very traumatic. We redid a redesign. We worked very hard to make it better, and we were successful in going to the moon and coming back. And there were many lasting relationships that were made on that basis.
Modernization, sophisticated design, and engineering techniques have lessened the risks of space travel, but the price of progress will always remain. The space race is no longer a race to the moon, but rather an economic race, and Brevardians vow to remain the frontrunner. What does the future hold for Florida's spaceport? NASA, in partnership with Russia's space agency, is currently constructing an international space station launched in stages, with its completion slated for the year 2003. Meanwhile, researchers are developing reusable unmanned launch vehicles such as VentureStar or X-33, designed by Lockheed Martin and funded by NASA. The hope is that one day X-33 will take the place of expendable rocket boosters that perish in the ocean after launching payloads.
Well, the vision for the VentureStar was a vehicle that would launch maybe every week. It would be fully reusable. It would come back from space. You'd literally refuel it like a jet plane and turn around and launch it again almost like a jet plane.
No one really knows what the future is because they can really land it anywhere, so it may or may not be here. And that's very emotional too, to think that, you know, this would not be the center for launch and landing.
NASA is constructing a reusable launch hangar with the anticipation that scientists and engineers will eventually design a feasible and functional vehicle, and the hope that the Cape will be its launch port.
My belief is that reusable vehicles, there's a lot of technological development needed and a lot of work to be done before you can replace the expendable vehicles that we have today with reusables. Reusables, as they come online, like the shuttle, will be used for low Earth orbit, but you've still got to get these payloads up to geosynchronous altitudes.
As NASA spends less on launches and more on research, Brevard County will have to compete to remain America's preeminent spaceport, as well as the future home port for VentureStar and other reusable launch vehicles.
A real potential reality would be for a system like VentureStar to come online, but that the shuttle would keep flying. For example, the VentureStar could fill a role of supplying the space station with equipment and materials, but that the shuttle would be the vehicle that would ferry astronauts to and from the station.
The landscape of the Cape is also changing as obsolete launch pads come down and aerospace contractors construct modern launch facilities which reflect the changing demands of the space industry. Complex 41 is the latest casualty, demolished to make way for Lockheed Martin's advanced facility to launch its larger Atlas V missile.
Boeing's new Launch Complex 37 represents the wave of the future in space and a shift in ideology as well as technology. Boeing is constructing this pad to meet the demands of a changing space industry, one that is shifting from traditional governmental payloads to more commercial cargo. It'll be the nation's first launch complex built from the ground up in 30 years and will accommodate the much larger Delta IV family of rockets.
It's built to be very operational, and in so doing, what we see is that the vehicles will be brought in horizontally and put together, rolled out to the pad and erected, with the payload being delivered shortly thereafter, for a cycle time out on the launch complex of around 8 days.
Launch Complex 37 replaces the traditional blockhouse command centers of the early rocket launches with a more comprehensive facility. The need for change became dramatically evident when a Delta rocket blew up over the launch pad.
We have LOS data at AE right now.
We have lost the signal from the data from the Delta III.
There was a lot of people that felt that it was not necessary, that the blockhouses were sufficient. You know, you've got 5 feet thick concrete walls around you. Just the explosion itself and the large pieces of solid motor that were coming down and impacting the ground like a bomb, basically, proved that it just wasn't safe.
The end of the 20th century is marked by man's continual pursuit of other worlds and life beyond. NASA space probes such as Mars Global Surveyor, Cassini, Lunar's Prospector, and Galileo explore the vast Milky Way, sending back high-resolution images which scientists hope will unlock celestial mysteries.
In my research, the book I've written on faith in space, I see a direct line of descent of God placing people in history to carry out all this stuff.
From a county and a part of Florida that was a century ago known as the Mosquito County, we've become the epicenter of the connection of this world and other worlds.
The future of space inspires much speculation rooted in fantasy and fact as humans imagine its endless possibilities.
It is not that crazy an idea. For example, it's been proposed that you could convert the cargo bay on the shuttle into a passenger module. And
if history repeats itself, then these ideas, which might sound like science fiction, are not so far-fetched. After all, the space program was built by dreamers.
We're going to have a large frequency of launches by lower-priced rockets, unmanned, and manned tugs, and we're going to take items up to the space station as well as to Earth orbit, and we're going to have miniature factories, and we're going to be bringing back pharmaceuticals, metals, alloys, all kinds of things that we haven't even thought about.
We're going to go to other planets, and I think the whole nation or the world should work towards that end.
We think it's a great accomplishment today to go to the moon, but landing on Mars and other planets, I predict that in several years will be more or less commonplace.
Today, younger generations help keep alive the dream of space exploration through programs such as Space Camp, held here at the Astronaut Hall of Fame on Merritt Island. These hands-on learning adventures inspire future generations of aerospace engineers, scientists, astronauts, and other high-tech careers.
Navigation systems or art? Go. T-minus 10 seconds.
Meanwhile, older generations are helping maintain this trailway to the stars blazed here in Brevard County through preservation efforts which salvage and restore rockets and space hardware destined for the trash heap. A dedicated group of volunteers at the U.S. Air Force Space and Missile Museum tirelessly work to repair and maintain these vestiges of early space, despite the fact there is very little funding. The museum not only preserves, but displays our space heritage and is open to public tours.
So basically what we're doing is we're taking them into the shop, stripping the paint completely off them, and restoring them from the inside out.
Museum volunteers are restoring many of the museum's display artifacts. This effort is an ongoing struggle against corrosive and sometimes violent forces of nature.
The reason I got involved with the museum was I came out here on a blue tour with NASA, and just talking to the people that come out here, the kids, even some of the older folks, they know nothing of the early space, what went on out here in the early days. This is more or less as the Kitty Hawk of the space age out here.
The space program also owes a debt of gratitude to other unofficial curators and historians who have taken the lead in safeguarding the legacy of space. Often they are space worker retirees who consider it not just a hobby, but rather a second calling.
So a lot of these trailers are filled up with material that you would find in a common, if you compared it to an auto supply store, like you'd find, this would be a rocket supply store.
This private storage houses old rockets, space hardware, and trailers full of miscellaneous parts collected and cataloged by a retired NASA engineer.
I hate to see the stuff turned back into molten metal. I think it has a history that should be preserved, and there are a lot of people around the country today that you ask them about some of these rockets, they don't even know what they are.
As the 21st century dawns, humans will continue questioning their place in the universe and wondering what's out there in the twinkling night sky. From the neon rings of Saturn to the volcanic craters of Mars and the many moons of Jupiter, Americans are only beginning to chart other worlds. The 20th century will be celebrated for its pioneering space flights, which put Brevard County forever on the map as the place from which mankind took its first steps into space.
We've got to keep that spirit in America somewhere, and God willing, we will.
The real strengths of the Space Coast, and indeed our entire nation's space program, are the people. The technical and engineering achievements both then and today pale in comparison to the personal commitment of the people who have sacrificed for and contributed to the exploration and development of space.
Well, the message I'd have for the first 50 years, that let's keep the programs going. Don't let it stop. And to me, it has to keep going. It's like a future generation that's got to be with us.